even first approached me about doing this program, they said, let's make it situational. Here we are in this pandemic. It's a difficult time. We're all experiencing difficulties and hardships of one sort or another. But is it possible that what we're experiencing is producing some opportunities for spiritual growth that we otherwise would not have had? And so that's the approach that we've taken here. How to structure this? There were an infinity of ways that I could structure this, and I decided to go with something that is very common in Orthodox theological and ascetical writings. St. John Maximovich had this very good quote. He said, "Until a man's earthly life finishes its course, up to the very departure of the soul from the body, the struggle between sin and righteousness continues within him." And so this struggle, this tension, this dichotomy, this opposition between sin and righteousness is always there. Another way to express it is seeing this struggle between sin and righteousness as a struggle between vice and virtue. And that's what I took as sort of the terminological distinction I wanted to make. This is the distinction that's made in a classic work of Orthodox spiritual guidance from St. Nicodemus, the Hagurite of the Holy Mountain, who was an 18th century figure, and St. Theophan the Recluse, a Russian figure of the 19th century. And they put together this wonderful compendium. It's available in a good English translation from St. Vladimir Seminary. If you don't have a copy, you may want to buy it. It's called Unseen Warfare. And this distinction between sin and righteousness that St. John Maximovich talks about, they want to talk about as vice and virtue. And I decided to follow that, since this is common both to the Christian East and the Christian West. This distinction between vice and virtue, I think, is a fundamental tenet of Orthodox spiritual life, and one that we have to understand. And so it brings us to this idea of the virtues and the vices. First of all, let me just say something about the virtues. I made this point many times in the first three sessions. Let me make it one final time. Virtue, our English word virtue, comes from the Latin word vir, V-I-R, which means man, a human being. A virtue is a quality in a person that makes that person be a human being, a real stellar man or woman. In other words, the humanity of that person is gauged by the virtues that that person holds. Those of you who know some Yiddish, in Yiddish, there's the very common thing when they say something very complimentary about someone, they'll say, that guy's a real mensch. Well, mensch is just the German Yiddish word for a man. And it expresses this. Someone is a good person, they're a mensch because they are human. They have these virtues that make them a human. Vices, on the other hand, vice comes from the Latin vitium, which means a blemish or a deformity of some sort, an imperfection. And you can have a vitium, a vice that's physical, but you can also have a vice, and this is the sense in which we usually use it, in moral life. There's a blemish in our moral comportment, a blemish in the way we behave towards God and towards others. And in Orthodox spiritual life, those blemishes, those vices are usually expressed in terms of passions. Passion is something that makes us suffer, a passio. And the passions are brought on by appetites or impulses that we have. And there are two schools of thought about this. Every human being has appetites and impulses. Impulses to sleep, impulses to talk, sexual impulse, things like that. We have these impulses and these appetites. Some people think that these appetites or impulses are intrinsically evil or unnatural. St. John Climacus and St. John of Damascus expressed this viewpoint. But the other viewpoint, which I was schooled in, which Metropolitan Callistus Ware and all the things I've read by him over the years favors, is that basically the appetites and the impulses are good. They're intrinsically good, but they become disfigured in us. To eat is a good impulse. If we didn't eat, we'd die. But when we feed ourselves excessively, it becomes gluttony. The sexual impulse is healthy and good. Without the sexual impulse, the human race would die out. But when we become obsessed with it, you have the kind of sexual pathologies that our culture has. In other words, you take an intrinsically good appetite or impulse and it becomes disordered. And that's what a vice is. And so the question is, what do we do with the vices? Do we train them or do we eradicate them? I would say the more popular opinion, the stance that I've assumed here and that many others do, is that the passions have to be trained. And the passions trained will not lead to vices and might even lead to virtues. So, how to pursue virtue? And this is where we get to the pandemic setting here. In order to grow spiritually, we have to be able to do spiritual discernment, to be able to sit ourselves down and, like a good doctor, diagnose within ourselves what it is that's causing the problem. And this spiritual diagnosis, the fathers say, require monaxia, solitude, as a prerequisite. And I know that solitude can be a problem for many people during the pandemic. You want to have solitude in the right dose, not too much solitude where people feel isolated, unhealthily isolated. And you want to have it as a voluntary thing, that people see solitude not as a punishment visited upon them, but as something they voluntarily embrace. And let's be honest, the pandemic has given us some opportunities for a detachment from a lot of the things that we were attached to before the pandemic. And rather than saying, this is all terrible, put on Netflix, I don't want to be detached from anything. Rather than doing that, my suggestion was we can embrace solitude, and solitude brings a monaxia, solitude brings stillness, hezekiah. And in that stillness, we can eliminate a lot of the interference that controls our life. And psychology and spirituality both say that solitude is a necessity for human beings. In the biological cycle, it's woven into our sleep. We spend a certain amount of time sleeping, which is a way of detaching ourselves from everything that interferes with our mind and our spirit while we're awake. So solitude should not just be interpreted as a physical distancing of persons from one another, but it should be understood as being alone, not only physically, but being detached from the usual rational attachments. And with the proper dosage, which is voluntary embracement, that is what leads to the diagnosis, the spiritual discernment that can lead to the cultivation of virtue and to the elimination of vices. By the way, I want to tell you something. This occurred to me this morning as I was on my way to church. I don't know whether you've all noticed it as well. You know, I have forgotten to look at my gas tank in the last 10 months because I'm not driving very much anymore. And the gas seems to be there forever. I've really cut back on my use of gas. I'm detached from a lot of the attachments that I had before. So I have to be careful to make sure I don't lose track of what I have or don't have in the gas tank. But I'm always very comforted by the fact that I always have more gas than I think I had. And that shows that this kind of detachment that the pandemic has brought is, I think, just now become part of our life, at least for a while, and probably a few months longer, maybe 5 or 6 months longer. But let's use it to some spiritual benefit when it's still there. And then I said, what are we going to focus on in looking at this conflict, this opposition between virtues and vices? We're going to look at a prayer that every one of us as Orthodox Christians know, the prayer of St. Ephrem the Syrian, who was a 4th century saint, an extremely talented and perceptive man. It's called the Harp of the Spirit, and he wrote hymns and exegetical pieces, scriptural interpretations, and poems. His language was Syriac. And by the way, our ancestral language in the Patriarchate of Antioch was Syriac before it was displaced by Greek. So this is our heritage. And he was born and died in what is today modern day Turkey. And I wanted to take the prayer of St. Ephrem as the basis for looking at 4 virtues and 4 vices, and looking at the relationship between them and hopefully come to a better understanding what virtue and vice is and how they interact in a person's life. I also have added several times the detail that it's good to use St. Ephrem the Syrian in the situation of a pandemic, because he himself died in 373 in what is today Urfa in Turkey. It's Edessa. It was Edessa in those times. And he died ministering to his people during a pandemic. He was a deacon. And so he knew how to thrive and survive spiritually in a pandemic situation. So it makes it very, very suitable for our purposes here. The prayer of St. Ephrem, you all know it. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, meddling, lust of power, and idle talk, but give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own sins and not to judge my brother, for thou art blessed unto ages of ages. Amen. Now, we all know this from Pre-Sanctified and from Compline and from weekday Vespers during Great Lent. And you could see that he lists 4 vices there: sloth, meddling, lust of power, and idle talk, and 4 virtues: chastity, humility, patience, and love. And that's how I structured the presentations I made so far. We've done sloth, meddling, and lust of power, and chastity, humility, and patience. Today, we deal with the last vice that he mentions, idle talk, and the last virtue he adduces, love. Archdeacon David and several of the other people who are participating in the past said, well, you know, Father, what you've given here, is there a relationship, sort of a cumulative effect, the way the vices are listed and the way the virtues are listed? It hadn't occurred to me before. That's why your questions and your comments are so important, because I think you're right. I do think that there is a building of the way that he lists the vices and the way he lists the virtues. For instance, sloth. You know what sloth is? It's laziness, not doing what you're supposed to do. And St. Paul talks about those who are slothful do not eat. Those who do not work do not eat. So sloth has this physical aspect of doing your job, doing what you're supposed to do. And if you don't, you're lazy and a no account, and you should not eat. All right? In other words, there is that physical aspect of laziness that is a vice that must be avoided in the spiritual life. The monks, however, said in addition to the physical aspect of sloth, not doing what you should be doing physically, there is a spiritual dimension to it. And that spiritual dimension of sloth, they call, the Greek word is akidia. And that means a listlessness, an apathy, not being invested in anything you do, losing your energy, sort of sputtering out. And they found out that this happened usually for monks who got up very early to begin their day. By the time they got to noon, they were experiencing this spiritual sloth, akidia. And they equated that with the noonday demon that's mentioned, I think, in Psalm 91, the noonday demon. And so this became one of the major spiritual vices that they fought against. Now, the next vice that's listed there is meddling, all right? This is really, I think, related to sloth. If you're lazy and not doing what you should be doing in your job, chances are you're going to have a lot of energy to interfere in everyone else's life. I had a dean at the college who used to say, you know something? He used to tell us, if everyone just did their job and stopped worrying about what everyone else was doing, 90% of our problems would disappear. If that was true at the college, it's true in the world as well. It always is amazing to me that people who are the most slovenly, the most sloppy, the most slothful in their own life always find enough energy to meddle in other people's lives and tell them what they should be doing. And so sloth does lead to this kind of meddling. And it was a problem in the early church. I mentioned the case of that power group of women in the early church, widows, who had to be over 60, and they had to be proven not to be meddlers and other busybodies. Meddling means expending energy in something that's none of your business, poking your nose in where it doesn't belong. All right. The next vice that we looked at was lust of power, philarkia. This is the urge we see in a lot of people, the desire to be in charge, to be number one, to tell everyone else what to do, to be the master, the one in control. And I'll tell you, this is everywhere in our culture. It's in families, it's in marriages, it's in churches, it's in government, certainly. All of these things, this lust of power is a lust that drives us all to madness and to disarray. And I told you, remember, I gave you the fable, Jotham's fable in Judges 9, and the story where when Abimelech wanted to be king over Israel, Jotham's told a fable. And in that fable, he said the trees wanted one of their own to be king over them. But, you know, the olive tree said, should I leave my work of producing olives, which provide this oil and fatness that everyone uses? And the fig tree says, should I leave my work of providing these sweet fruits that everyone enjoys to become a leader over everyone, impose myself over others? And the grapevine said, what? Should I leave my vine, which produces wine that makes all of mankind happy, to be king over everyone else? And the only tree that said, yes, I will accept to have control over the situation, the only tree that gave into lust of power, was the bramble, which had nothing but thorns anyway. And so the fable was, this is something to be avoided. Today, we're going to look at idle talk as the last of the vices. And my hunch is we're going to see that the tongue, the use of the tongue, is one of the smallest but one of the most effective weapons people use to get power. And quickly with the virtues, it's the same way. We looked at chastity, and we saw that chastity is not to be understood just sexually the way it often is. Abstaining from sex is chastity. Chastity in Greek has the broader sense of sober-mindedness, being self-restrained, being balanced, not flying off the handle, not being pathologically impulsive, having balance and restraint and a tempered approach to things. If you have that, chances are you're going to be a humble person. And we saw the humility, tapinophrosini in Greek, means lowliness, being at the ground level rather than at the top of the heap. And even humility in Latin, which gives us humilitas, gives us our English word humility, humus is the ground. So in both Greek and Latin, humility refers to lowliness, not to the insistence of being at the top of the heap. And we saw, and by the way, many of you like the quote from St. Paisius that says, if you want to tune into God, if you see God as a radio, you have to change the tuner to humility. That's the wavelength on which God really is present and is attentive. Humility is related to patience. There are two words in Greek. Hypomone means bearing up, enduring underneath something, rather than when you're getting irritated by someone, just dismissing them and flying off the handle at them and writing them off. Patience means bearing up with that. And then the other Greek word is makrothymia, which means long suffering. In other words, suffering other people is not easy. And if you develop the quality of being able to do that, then chances are that's a result of your commitment to humility. So you see how chastity leads to humility, leads to patience. And finally, today, we're going to look at love. And that's such a general word. We use it all the time that it has almost no meaning in English anymore. But we're going to break that down to see what's really involved there. Okay, so let's look at idle talk. All right, argologia. Argologia is the Greek word. Argos in Greek means not working, not getting anything done, not accomplishing anything. All right. Again, it's sort of related to sloth in a way. God's word, the divine word, if you look in the scripture, the divine word is effective. How did God create the entire universe? By the spoken word. All right. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be dry land, and there was dry land. In other words, God's word, he never speaks a word that doesn't have an effect. He never speaks a word that comes back empty. Human beings, on the other hand, excel in speaking empty words and multiplying them. That's what I do as an academic. So I can tell you, as someone who is an autogologist professionally, I can tell you that's what we do. We multiply words. And that's why autogologia is translated as idle talk. In other words, talk that doesn't really accomplish anything. It's a lazy talk. And it's related, another translation is talkativeness. You know, nothing is more irritating than someone who never shuts up. The talkativeness is really something, it's like a chatterbox, someone chattering. And by the way, I learned a new word. Have you heard this word before? I was talking to someone, Father John T-Badge, who's a good friend of mine, and his wife is Canadian. And she used the word nattering. Oh, that woman was nattering on about something. I said, what's that word? Nattering. They said, oh my God, there's a word you don't know? I said, I've never heard that word. Did you all hear that word before? Nattering?
Never heard that.
Okay, but what it means is chattering, just going on and on, talking and saying nothing. So that's, and remember, you all saw Sound of Music, right? You remember the song, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria? How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? How do you solve a problem like Maria? And they call her a flibberty gibbet. A flibberty gibbet. A flibberty gibbet is a person who's constantly talking and saying nothing. All right. So that's really one of those words that probably would occur on Jeopardy. All right. But that's what it is. A flibberty gibbet is someone who is a victim of autogologia, talks constantly and says nothing and doesn't know how to shut up. All right. And probably worst of all is autogologia can be destructive talk, gossip, slander, or detraction. And in my sermons, I often make this distinction between slander and detraction. You all know what slander is. Archdeacon David is the lawyer. You know what it is. When you defame someone and say something about them that is not true, all right? To slander someone is, it's a crime. You could be charged with it and be made to pay a price for it. Detraction is saying something true about someone, but it's still destructive. In other words, what you might say, what you're saying in slander is saying something false about someone, making up a lie that's destructive. We all know that's bad. That's a no-brainer. But even if you're saying something that's true, that runs someone down, that destroys their reputation, that makes them lose their standing or their well-being, that's detraction. And that's also considered a moral ill. So that's part of autogologia. The word autogologia itself, the Greek word autogologia, is not found in the New Testament, but the idea certainly is. And I want to read this passage, which everyone should really reflect on. It's in James chapter 3. It's I think, one of the best passages in the New Testament. And it warns against the tongue. And it calls the tongue a restless evil full of deadly poison. This is what causes autogologia. James chapter 3 says this, look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a little member and boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is an unrighteous world among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the cycle of nature, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by humankind, but no human being can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men, who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brethren, this ought not to be so. That passage from James is a renunciation of autogologia. Um, and in the patristic writings, in the ascetic writings, you have St. John of Carpathos, who was a 7th century ascetic, who wrote a text called 100 Texts. And there are 3 brief passages from there that I think base themselves on this revelation in the Epistle of James and even take it further with imagery. St. John of Carpathos says, we shall have to give account for every idle word, every argologia, and conceited word spoken by our ill-disciplined tongue. Let us guard then our tongue with watchfulness. It has been well said, better to slip on the ground than to slip with your tongue. It's from Sirach. We should believe James the Apostle when he writes, let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak. By the way, in almost every vice, encountering almost every vice, the sort of the panacea, the cure-all for most vices is silence. And that's especially true of argologia. And then the last quote, he says, how can anyone expect pity if he recklessly approaches a poisonous snake? You should avoid those who cannot control their tongue, who are quarrelsome and full of agitation inwardly or outwardly. This is what argologia is, this idle talk that can be so destructive. And that's why you can see it is born of the vices that we've seen so far. Sloth leads to meddling, meddling leads to lust of power, and a way to destroy someone who stands in your way from exercising unleashed power is idle talk. Run them down, and that way you have control. St. Philotheos of Sinai said this, nothing is more unsettling than talkativeness and more pernicious than an unbridled tongue, disruptive as it is of the soul's proper state. For the soul's chatter destroys what we build each day and scatters what we have laboriously gathered together. What is more disastrous than this uncontrollable evil? That's from that passage from James we just read. The tongue has to be restrained, checked by force, and muzzled, so to speak, and made to serve only what is needful. Who can describe all the damage that the tongue does to the soul? By the way, I love people walking their dogs have muzzles on them. Have you seen them? People walking their dogs with muzzles. How many times I've thought, boy, they should make a human version of this. And certain people should really be muzzled. All right. And I'd be willing to pay for them, you know, but we need this. And we do it for dogs. But as James says, we train every beast, but no one trains the tongue. And finally, from St. Theodore of Edessa. Remember, Edessa was where St. Ephraim the Syrian died. Expel from yourself the spirit of talkativeness, for in it lurk the most dreadful passions, lying, loose speech, absurd chatter, buffoonery, obscenity. To put the matter succinctly, through talkativeness you will not escape sin, whereas a silent man is a throne of perceptiveness. Moreover, the Lord has said that we shall have to give an account of every idle word. That's in Matthew 12:36. Thus, silence is most necessary and profitable. So this is why I think when you look at that succession of vices, the easiest one in many ways to fall into, and actually the most pointed and destructive of all those vices, is idle talk, because it's so easy to do, just to misuse your tongue to run someone down, whether falsely or even truthfully. This is a great spiritual principle that we have to take into consideration. That's the vice, the last vice. And the last virtue that we're considering today is love. And love. We talk about love all the time. One gets tired of it, except when you break it down a little bit more. Yeah, this is a word that's so overused that it's come to lack meaning. Many of you have read C.S. Lewis, the great Christian author, the British Christian author who wrote a book, The Four Loves. And in The Four Loves, he talks about how in Greek, Greek doesn't have one word for love. It has 4 words for love. And this really shows that Greek culture understood that love was a complex thing, and there were gradations of it. There were levels of it. The first is eros. And this is, I would say, biologically based love. When you're sexually attracted to someone, physically attracted to someone, this is where our English word erotic comes from. And this is a good thing. I mean, this is a form of love that's necessary for the perpetuation of the human race. But that's in many ways the lowest level of love. It's the most, quote unquote, natural, the most physical. Then there's philia. And of course, in the great state of Pennsylvania, you have the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia's name, Adelphos, in Greek means brother. Philia means love, love of a friend, love of a brother, okay? Love of someone who is a fellow to you. In other words, philia is a love between friends, loyalty between friends. Then you have storgi. Storgi is family love. It's a love of a parent for a child, a love of a child for a parent, or between relatives, brothers and sisters, and so forth. In other words, storgi is familial love, love within the family. You could say this is also biologically based. It is, but not so biologically basic as eros. And then you have this 4th level of love, agape. And this is the kind of love that's referred to in the prayer of St. Ephraim. When he talks about love, he's not talking about eros and talking about philia and talking about storgi. He's talking about agape. By the way, I had a professor, Christopher Stendhal, is a great New Testament scholar, and he said he was a Lutheran pastor, and he said he refused at weddings. Everyone wanted 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul talks about love is patient, love is kind, love is not. He says, at most weddings, the love that's most front and center on people's mind is eros and maybe philia, but not agape. All right. So he said, no, you have to find another reading rather than this. And agape is a kind of unconditional love. It's a love where you're not getting anything in return, but you express it anyway. It's self-sacrificial love. It's a love that's born of sacrifice, not of, negotiating, you do something for me, I do something for you. Let's be in a relationship where it's mutually beneficial. Agape doesn't do that calculus. The calculus of benefit, advantage is gone from agape. And what agape does, it draws together all the other virtues because the self is brought into control. The self is humbled. The self is made to do nothing other than what God requires of the self, and that's expressed in this self-sacrificial love. It brings the greatest and the most important reward. As I was putting this together, I was watching television. And I want to tell you, agape has made some very current ads that you see on television. And who's using agape to sell their product? Insurance companies. Now you're saying, what are you talking about, Father? I hope this works. There's an inappropriate use of agape in contemporary PR culture. New York Life Insurance Company has an ad. If you watch any amount of television, I'm not talking about, Netflix, I'm talking about just regular television. They have an ad that's running called, this is why you want New York Life Insurance Company. Let me see if I can call this up. And if it is, it's only 30 seconds. But watch this. I hope it works. It does.
The ancient Greeks had 4 words for love. The most admirable is called agape, love as an action. For 175 years, New York Life has been helping people act on their love. So they can look back or look ahead and say, we got it right. We did good.
Now, very nice. But let me tell you, most insurance companies I've dealt with are not there for sacrificing themselves. At best, they're there to practice philia, taking care of someone they consider a fellow, a brother, a friend. But it's not agape. All right. Insurance companies collect money, and usually they collect more than they give out. That's not agape. All right. Then I came across another one. There's actually an insurance in California called Agape Insurance. They're even more brazen about it than New York Life Insurance. They have an ad too. Let's see if I can get this one up. Well, this is a video, but it's Agape Insurance Services. Call us today. Look at it, 888 John 316. This is just too much. And this is the appropriation of a biblical term for love that really doesn't have much to do with insurance. Okay, a little closer maybe to reality. It's Agape Diamonds. All right. And remember what I said about Christopher Stendhal saying, you know, all this romantic love is really not agape. It might be eros tempered with philia, and you're becoming family. So storge is there, but is it really agape? Well, Agape Diamonds wants you to think that you should buy their diamonds because this is an expression of the kind of love they're about.
Incredible journey. And your engagement ring should be as unique as your love. For a limited time only, get a free pair of 14-karat white gold stud earrings with the purchase of any engagement ring. On sale now, up to 50% off. Starting at just $12.89. AgapeDiamonds.com.
Well, let me tell you, $12.89 for the starting price is hardly self-sacrificial. All right. But you could see that agape is appealed to in PR because it's the highest form of love. But I think in many ways, to be quite honest, it's an inappropriate use of agape. The kind of agape that's referred to in the prayer of St. Ephrem is this highest form of self-sacrificial love. And let me conclude by saying that the prayer of St. Ephrem ends with a concluding petition. Grant me to see my own sins and not to judge my brother. In other words, in listing the vices and the virtues, do not judge anyone else. And we all know this passage from Matthew chapter 7. Judge not, lest ye be judged. It's funny, you know, I've been using the Revised Standard Version for years, but when I have biblical passages memorized, it's almost always in the King James Version, just because the language is so much more beautiful. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Judge not, that you might not be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? So after listing these virtues and vices and really diagnosing yourself, St. Ephrem is saying, don't judge others. Again, probably the ascetic father I've quoted most in this series is St. Paisius the Athonite. And he says this: if man doesn't start to work on himself, then the devil will find another job for him. And what's that job? To seek for flaws in others. In other words, if you're judging others, you're not paying attention. You're being slothful to what your real job is, and that is to tend to yourself and not to meddle in other people's business, judging them. So you see, it all does tie together. This prayer is a masterwork, and it does draw all these things together. Father Seraphim Rose says the only acceptable judgment, and I like this, is the old man. In other words, how many of you priests who have done baptism, you have this little infant in the arms, and you're saying, cast out the old man and invest it with the new man. Well, the old man is our sinful nature. And, you know, even after baptism, even though we are grafted into the source of victory against evil, the old man is still in us. The only acceptable judgment is directed to the old man in ourselves. And in other words, the vestiges of that sinful self. Father Seraphim says, don't criticize or judge other people. Regard everyone else as an angel. Justify their mistakes and weaknesses and condemn only yourself as the worst sinner. This is step one in any kind of spiritual life. He, of course, was a 20th century figure, a modern figure. So you can see how Saint Ephrem lists the virtues and vices, and he ends up with this injunction not to judge. And my final advice in this series is this. We talk about controlling the passions, having rational control over the lower parts of ourselves. And, you know, the ancient Greeks, the Platonists especially, believed that the insensate power of the soul, the part of the soul that gives rise to, you know, intense emotional response, must be controlled by the rational. But the rational power of the soul is not sufficient for the task. It must be empowered and guided aright by the Spirit. Only the Holy Spirit can purify the intellect. The purpose of Christian life is not just to hold tight and do right by your own power. The purpose of the Christian life is to be empowered to have the victory over the sinful aspects of human nature. And that power comes not from ourselves, even though we have to cooperate with it, but it requires the Holy Spirit. And that's why the purpose of Christian life is the act. Saint Seraphim Sarovsky, Saint Seraphim of Sarov said, the purpose of Christian life is the acquisition of the Holy Spirit, because only in the power of the Spirit can this victory be won. Saint Diadochos, who flourished in the 5th century, said only the Holy Spirit can purify the intellect, for unless a greater power comes and overthrows the despoiler, what he has taken captive will never be set free. In every way, therefore, and especially through peace of soul, we must make ourselves a dwelling place for the Holy Spirit. Then we shall have the lamp of spiritual knowledge burning always within us. And when it is shining constantly in the inner shrine of the soul, not only will the intellect perceive all the dark and bitter attacks of the demons, but these attacks will be greatly weakened when exposed for what they are by that glorious and holy light. How many of our prayer services in the Orthodox Church begin with what we began with tonight, the invocation of the Holy Spirit? Because it's only in the power of the Spirit that we have the power to do anything that's going to result in victory over vices and the cultivation of virtue. And as the last step in this, what I want us all to do right now, before we break for questions and comments, to say together the prayer of St. Ephrem. So let's do that. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, meddling, lust of power, and idle talk, but give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own sins and not to judge my brother, for thou art blessed unto ages of ages. Amen. I hope that in a couple of months, when we enter into Great Lent and you hear this prayer, some of the insights that were discussed in this series come back to you. And this prayer takes on a new life for the elimination of vice and the cultivation of virtue. And so I'm going to stop there. Any questions, any comments, things you want to add, things you want to ask about, have at it. The time is yours.
Father, thank you once again from all of us and on behalf of all of us here. I can almost see where maybe this is leading to someday, maybe God willing, our next session on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. And
yes,
could you tease us a little bit with what you might say about that for in just a couple of minutes, maybe?
Well, think about it.
Same question, Dave.
Well, I look at it this way. I mean, basically, I'm an historian, and I'm a real Antiochian when it comes to interpreting scripture. And that is, I look primarily at the literal and historical text rather than an allegorical interpretation. Think about it. Why did Christ come? Okay, we celebrate the birth of Christ at the end of this month. Christ came, you say, okay, he was born so that he could teach. Yeah, he had to do that, but that wasn't the completion of his work. He had to die for our sins, people will say. That's why he came. Yeah, but that's not the completion of his work. He had to rise to show that he is the Lord of life and death. And by his self-same power, even though the earliest proclamation said he was raised from the dead, in time Christians proclaim he rose from the dead, and he is still risen, the victor over death. But to rise over death is not the end of his work either. The conclusion of Christ's work, the culmination, the purpose to which all of those, the birth, the teaching, the death, the resurrection, were all aiming, was when he ascends to the Father and he asks the Father to send the Paraclete. That is the seal of Christ's work. So everything we do, I think it's just a matter of attitude more than anything else. We have to tell ourselves that the purpose of what we do in prayer, the purpose of what we do in works, the purpose of what we do in study, in reading scripture, in having sessions like this, is to be able to immerse ourselves more in the life of the Holy Spirit. The problem with so much of Christianity, it's like swimming without getting into the water. You learn a lot about the history, you learn a lot about the theology, the controversies, the scripture, but you never dive into the pool. Diving into the pool is experiencing that life in the Spirit. And how does that come? That comes from prayer, not just going through the words, but arriving at a point where words are no longer important and images are no longer important, but just being in the presence of God and immersed in the Spirit. That's the apex of prayer. And that's what we should be aiming for. All the things we do in liturgy, it's necessary. Please don't hear me saying it's not, but it's a step in this gradual approach where we experience the life of the Spirit. And what is that experience? We do have glimpses of it. It's a joy beyond telling. It's a clarity that is beyond your own clarity of mind. It's the ability to dance for joy, even in the midst of sorrow. These are things that the Spirit brings. Read in Paul's epistles how many times he talks about the gift of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit. That's what it's all about. And how do you engage? How do you gauge your spiritual life? See what Paul says in Galatians. See what he says about the life and the fruit of the Spirit, and ask yourself, how many of these things are manifest in my life? It's not just about controlling ourselves or psychologizing ourselves correctly, but in asking the Spirit to enter into our life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save us by working within us. When that happens, you recognize what the purpose of Christian life is. And that Spirit binds it all together. Without the Spirit, it's just like a seminary curriculum where you have a few courses in scripture, a few courses in systematic theology, a few courses in ethics. But what binds it all together? What binds it all together is that experience of the Spirit. And how do you get it? You get it by doing it. How do you learn how to swim well? By getting into the water. And first you doggy paddle, then you swim a lap, then you're able to swim the length of an Olympic pool. And then finally, it's like the water bears you up. The water bears you up. And that's what the spiritual life has to be. It's a process. It's a process. And so how do you do it? You do it. You start the process and do it. Same way, how do you swim? How do you become an Olympic swimmer? Get in the water. And people who want to have the experience without getting in the water, this is what we want as American. Gee, can't we have a pill for this? I mean, this is actually, this is discussed in a lot of secular circles dealing with religion. Isn't there some way to just stimulate the brain to have a religious experience? Well, you might be able to experience something in the brain, but it's not the Spirit. I mean, I think human beings, to be quite honest, are hardwired to be receptive to the Spirit. And that's why religion will change. Different forms of religion will come and go, but religion will never disappear from the human scene because we all have this need as human beings to transcend. And that transcending is the image of God in us, the spirit seeking the prototype, the spirit with a capital S. It's just a natural part of who we are. And the reason why, pardon my French, and so many people are screwed up is because they contradict that natural impulse in themselves to transcend and connect with the one in whose image they're created. If you don't do that, you're going to end up being deformed somehow, or at least have a truncated development. And there's a lot of that going around. So that's my response to a question. It's a non-response, but it's sort of a way of trying to get a hold on the whole issue.
No, it's a great trailer for our next sessions someday soon. If I just had, I have one other follow-up, and then I will stay silent here. The idle talk, the comparison between idle talk and love. We hear, as you said, so much about love today. But we also sometimes, I think, feel like we are obligated to speak the truth in love, which requires us to say things to people, sometimes people we love, maybe in a family or a friend sense. What if any obligations do we have to counsel people and use our tongues to do that, maybe in a way that might be seen today even as judgmental by some people? Or should we just basically stay silent and accept it, as we're urged today by so many, I think, to just accept these things, if not accept the person?
Well, you raise a perfect question. This is something we all deal with, sometimes even within our families and even within ourselves. Listen, remember what I said earlier, my basic rule is never give answers to questions you haven't been asked. But you have to wait for that time when people are in a bad way. I do believe, I always tell young people this, they say, why should we do what the church says is the moral thing to do? I said, listen, I can't give you any answer to that question except this, and I guarantee this: if you do what the church's moral guidance said you should do, you will never destroy yourself. If you deviate from it, something's going to happen where you're going to damage yourself. If God forbid, you might even destroy yourself. So when people arrive at a point where they're damaged, where they realize it isn't working, or something in my life is not what it should be, and they say that to you, and they ask, what should I do? That's when you speak the truth in love. All right. But in love, why is that in love added? Because your purpose, when you're giving idle talk, your purpose is to destroy the other person, either by uttering a falsehood or a truth about them. Here, the purpose in speaking is to bring forth the healing of that person. But I do think people have to want to hear what you have to say. They might not accept it at first. As one of my parishioners told me, you'll say something, and I said, this guy's nuts. And then I'll go home and think about it. And 2 weeks later, I've come to the same opinion. You just have to let it sit and gestate for a while. And then it will bear fruit. It's not you bearing the fruit, it's the Spirit bearing the fruit. But I think you have to speak the truth in love when you see people destroying themselves or doing harm to themselves. And when they come to you and express this kind of frustration that things aren't going the way they should be, that's when you speak the truth in love. By the way, why do you think self-help books, I remember when there were bookstores, now books are sort of a thing of the past, but you used to go into bookstores, go into, Barnes and Noble or whatever, and you notice that like in the 60s, the self-help part was this little slim shelf in the back of the bookstore. And then in the 70s, it expanded a little bit more. In the 80s, it expanded more. By the time you got to the 90s, the whole wall of the bookstore was self-help books. People are looking for things that ameliorate what they experience in life, make it better. And so that's when you speak the truth in love. It's a matter of being able to articulate it and waiting for the right opportunity. I don't think people hear what you have to say unless they ask the question. And they might not ask the question bluntly, but they'll ask it in an indirect way. And if you've struggled with something they're struggling with, that's all the more powerful in your response. I was talking to a group of young adults at our parish in Toronto this past Tuesday. And the first question that the young adults asked is, why does God allow us to suffer? How can God allow all this suffering? And I said, listen, I will give you this response and see how it sits with you. The word to suffer in Greek, in Latin, is passio, to suffer. The only way you can have compassion, calm means with, and passio means suffer. The only way you can suffer with others, have compassion for others, and build them up, is if you've gone through some suffering and have struggled through it, and then you can identify with them and help them to gain the victory as well. If you never suffer anything, you would not be able to be compassionate. But if you suffer and suffer well and struggle with it, you can become compassionate with others and edify the others, build that person up. Without suffering, you can't do that. I think the reason why God allows suffering in the world is because the only way the world is going to survive is through compassion. And without suffering, there can be no compassion. So I do think that all of these things, bind together. And you want to build up other people. And sometimes the way to build up other people is to identify with their suffering and help them to see a way out of it. Support groups. In my bulletin board at church, I noticed that more and more space on the bulletin board was devoted to flyers from support groups, divorce support groups, loss of a loved one support groups. So, end of life disease support groups. People who have suffered through this can help others. We're not in this alone. And God knows, and we sometimes don't realize that we're all interconnected somehow. And that compassion even goes to dealing with animals and plants and things like that. I mean, I'll tell you, I know people, my neighbor once said to me, their dog died. And I love this dog. Even my cat loved this dog. That says something. And when the dog died, the wife, I could hear her crying sometime. And her husband said, she won't cry for me that way when I die. But the reason why animals are good to have is they teach us, animals have unconditional love. You have to feed them. That's all you have to do. And then they're there in your corner forever. And there's a nobility of spirit about animals that teach us agape and teach us how to love in a way that we experience suffering when they lose them. And that compassion we learn in dealing with animals. Show me someone who's cruel to an animal, and I'll show you someone who's cruel to other people as well.
Is that the word empathy as well?
Yes, exactly. I mean, empathy means you get into the feeling of the other person. Sympathy and empathy, I've never been sure what the distinction is. I think sympathy is seen as more intense even than empathy. But empathy is that identification with what the other is feeling. I see sympathy is, I think, even more intense than that. But unless you have feeling, how can you empathize or sympathize? It's just not possible. So we're not machines. And life is filled with, if you're going to live a life, you're going to experience something that isn't perfect. And that brings suffering. And how you deal with suffering determines how you can be compassionate with others. So.
Father, could you speak to the definition of idle talk? Give some examples of what idle talk is, because we know what evil talk is, and perverse talk and that type of cursing and things of that nature. But what is just idle talk that we're going to be judged for?
Well, it's a really great question. And here's the way I say it for myself. If I'm about to say something, either in conversation or even in a course I was teaching, or certainly in a sermon, I always ask this question: what is my purpose in saying that? In other words, what purpose lies behind what I'm going to say? If I'm teaching in a course, why do I bring up this point? What's my purpose? If I am preaching, why am I bringing this up? In other words, I think idle talk does not have a purpose. It's the end in itself. In other words, it produces nothing other than itself. And you know what? When do we do that? We do that primarily in entertainment in our culture. You know, let me give you an idea of idle talk. Idle talk, which, you know, really verges on slander, detraction, is what you see on Entertainment Tonight every night. It's a gossipy kind of say, this will give you a little thrill, and this will make you think that you're not so bad after all, because after all, look what we're telling you about this person who is, you know, famous. In other words, what's the purpose of saying those things? It's not a positive purpose. It seems to be a purpose of, I don't know, self-gratification at the expense of others. That, I think, is idle talk. And it does intersect with evil talk. But I think not all idle talk is obviously evil. It's just non-productive. It's unproductive. It's not aimed at any goal. It's not, doesn't, you know, to use the technical language, it's not positively teleological. It doesn't have a good goal in mind when we use it. So,
Facebook.
what's that?
It sounds like what's on Facebook.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Oh, now,
I'm writing, I guess.
no, you're absolutely right. You know, I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, which I've never used. I do it so I can log on to others. All right. I don't have Facebook because I see so much of what goes on in Facebook. I ask my students, what are you talking about all the time? I mean, they're constantly on their phones. They're constantly Facebooking. And now I don't know what's up and all these other apps. I mean, it's like they don't have, we used to joke about certain scholars, they never had an unpublished thought in their life. Well, a lot of these students don't have, you know, an unexpressed feeling or thought that really has no purpose other than just to get it out there. I don't care what you had for lunch. I don't care, you know, how boring my lecture was. I mean, I don't care. And why does your friend care? I mean, in other words, wouldn't that time be better spent in silence and reflection rather than just jabbering? Rather than just nattering? There, I've used the word. Rather than just nattering. You know, I think that, yeah, Facebook is a prime example of that. People are addicted, man. They're addicted to it. At least email, unless it's gossipy email usually has a purpose. There's a meeting being planned. There's something that needs to be done. But Facebook just seems to me a lot of idle talk. With pictures, even better, because a picture is worth 1,000 idle words. So. Any others? Well, let me just say.
Father, I had one more if I can.
Okay, sure.
Don't mind. I'm going to go slightly off topic, I guess, but that's where the fun is, and maybe it's not so off topic after all. Can you just say a word to us as we kind of approach 2021 here? Because I know this is something you've thought about a lot, but can you talk about how we as Orthodox Christians going into the new year with all things that we've said in mind, how do we approach others? How do we regard others who are perhaps, well, not Christians, Muslims, Jews, and even people that are more and more, I think, vocally atheist about things. You've talked in these sessions about us being an alternative and presenting as an alternative, and that I think goes to how we act and how we view ourselves. But how do we act towards others using these kinds of things that you've talked about who don't share our faith, and specifically maybe again our Muslim and Jewish neighbors, and then also those neighbors who really are actively saying there really is no transcendent kind of ideal.
I deal with this every day. I think most people do. I think here's what we have to do. Whenever you meet someone, The first question that you should ask is, which I think is our sort of natural impulse, gee, this person is so different from me. Who are they? Where are they from? What are they? And there's a tendency in us to always look at what is different with that other person, how they differ from us. Why not go with another person? Whenever you meet another person, the exercise that should be going on in your mind is, what is the common ground I have with that other person? I mean, first of all, they're a person. What does that mean? You know, I think that if you look for the common ground first, and then you can begin to really listen to that person. For instance, atheists don't bother me because I don't believe there is any atheist. I believe there are people who reject various understandings of God that they have found unacceptable and inappropriate as expressed by certain religious people. They reject that and they say, I don't believe in God. What they're saying is, I don't believe in the way you've depicted God, the way you packaged him, and the way you're trying to voice God on me. But unless I can talk to that atheist first as another human being, I want to hear that person out about what they're rejecting, about those other those understandings that they think is what we teach about God. It's usually a teachable moment because you find out, well, I don't believe that either. And they say, well, what do you believe? My God, you're a priest. What do you believe about God? It gives you an opportunity to talk about how their construct of God that they've adopted from other people. Let me tell you, some of the understandings of God I hear preached in other churches, I reject that God they're preaching. Does that make me an atheist? It does not. It makes me someone who says they have an improper understanding of who God is. But unless I am communicating with those people on a common ground, namely our shared humanity, I don't even have the ability to make that conversation. The people who really fascinate me the most are not atheists so much as anti-theists. There are a lot of people who say, you know, I don't believe in God. That doesn't bother me so much. But when they have this vitriolic, you know, hostile idea about God, they hate the very idea of God, any idea of God. That is the roughest one to deal with. But again, I think if you look at that person as a person, I've never met an atheist or an anti-theist who's not angry about something. And they'll say, I'll show this God. I'm going to say, I'm going to deal him the biggest blow I can deal to him. I don't believe in you. But when you hear that person's story, there's usually some kind of pain underneath it all that you can deal with and at least understand and have that person soften up quite a bit or temper their opinion. In other words, when we meet people different from ourselves, look for the common ground first. And on the basis of that common ground, see what kind of authentic communication can occur. That's why, by the way, I think that the academic study of religion, not theology, what we do in seminary, Father Michael, what we do in preparing to be particular representatives of our faith tradition, but I'm talking about the academic study of religion in secular institutions like Dickinson, for instance. It brings about such good spiritual fruit because people can see the common ground and begin an authentic dialogue. Whereas before they understood anything about those other persons, the other traditions, just wrote them off as crazy people. And, you know, it's very easy to demonize someone you don't know. It's very hard to demonize someone you do know. So the purpose of the academic study of religion is not to say that all religions are equal. I certainly don't say that, but every religion is worthy of being understood. And that is something that I think provides the ability to deal with people different from ourselves in a way that's less than, you're different, you're an enemy, let me destroy you. If that's the case, we're in a heap of trouble.
Yeah, you made that point that behind every, atheist or anti-theist, there's that anger. And my experience is often behind the anger, there's hurt.
Exactly. And, if in your discussion with those people, if they find in you someone that they can vent to or at least discuss things with, there's a healing that takes place. They might not become a believer, but at least they won't become such a fanatical anti-belief person.
Yeah, so that leads to a question I have, and it kind of goes back to the topic. How much do you think our hurt, pain is sort of at the crossroads between going towards the vices for the virtue. I mean, you know, I haven't met a lot of like bad people that just naturally want to do bad because it's bad. But in myself and in others, I think we're trying to ameliorate pain. Would you say that that's often the motivation?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, listen, I think underlying a lot of vices, underlying a lot of vices is anger. I do think that anger is at the base of a lot of vices. And what anger is, it's like, it's a corrosive force. It destroys anything good. And everyone has some anger about something. And unless we're able to face that anger and sort of root it out, or at least face it for what it really is, it's easy to fall into one vice after another, where those vices are merely a whole range of expressions of anger. But unless you get to the anger at the basis of them all, you know, you want to have power over other people because you're angry that other people have power over you. You want to run other people down with idle talk because they're doing that to you. You want to meddle in other people's lives because people have been meddling in yours. You want to be slothful because other people aren't doing their job. Why should I do mine? All right. In other words, anger is sort of like the root of a lot of that evil. So I think, again, it comes to terms with coming for us discerning our own kind of spiritual illness. And once that happens, you begin to control the vices a lot better. And once you eliminate or neutralize, at least somewhat, anger, the virtues become much easier to acquire. And as St. Ambrose, I think I gave the quote a few weeks ago, once you acquire one virtue, it's like learning a language. Once you learn one language, it's easier to learn another. Once you acquire one virtue, it's easier to acquire another. But until you eliminate the anger, I mean, listen, let's talk about a lot of the sexual sin in our society is not because people are just mad lechers. It's because they're angry about something. A lot of sexual dysfunction and, you know, crime is more an expression of anger than it is of lust. You know, anger is, and look at our culture. What does our culture do? What do we do in entertainment? What do we do in politics? What do we do in music? What do we do in athletics? We spend all this time and energy trying to get people really mad about something. There's people constantly stoking the fire of anger. This is demonic. It is not just ill-advised, it's demonic. And the more anger is stoked, the more someone stokes anger, the more you avoid that person. And there are a lot of religious people who specialize in it, to be quite honest with you. So this is, you know, this goes across the board of whatever religious denomination, whatever political party, whatever entertainment favorites you have. The cultivation of anger is a demonic exercise, and it bears nothing but vice and discourages the development of virtue. Anger is the problem, he said angrily. So, you know.
Unless anybody else has other questions, I just wanted to thank Father Ted for all your time and effort and wisdom preparing these and sharing them with us. It's just on behalf of the whole community, thank you. You've been a blessing to us, and hopefully this is the beginning of some others as well.
I love Sam. I got a thumbs up and a salute. Thank you, Sam.
And good to see Father Dan Elfrida joining us. Nice to see your faces.
Yes, it's an honor. Sharaftuna, as they say in Arabic, honored us. So thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity. And it's been great. I have found, I just wrote my Christmas encyclical, which I'm sending out. And I said, you know, I found that I'm doing as much ministry now as I did when I was full-time in the parish, but it's transforming itself in certain ways. It's much more of a teaching kind of priestly work within the church. And, you know, God is good. He provides all kinds of opportunity. And I remember I had a mentor who said, Pulchini, I want to tell you, don't think you're ever going to make a big difference in the world, but ask yourself this, are things a little better for your having passed through? And if you could say yes to that, you've done what you're required to do. So that's what I'm trying to do. And this is an opportunity to do it. And I thank you very much for the invitation. So Have a good rest of the activity fast. Good, health. Right?
Bye.
All right. Good night, all.
Merry Christmas.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, Father Ted.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks to the pandemic, we are hearing you.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, we can thank the pandemic for this.
Some good things came out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Good night.
Good night, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Good night, Grand Rapids.
Good night, Austin.
Round Rock.
Round Rock.
Round Rock. Got your card. Bye-bye.